Hi, everybody. You're listening to the Grow Wire podcast. I'm your host, Fritz Nelson, and I'm joined by Kendall Fisher, producer and host of the Grow Wire Show.
Hey, everyone.
On this episode, I sat down with Kelly Leonard, Executive Vice President of the world-renowned theater, The Second City. And I can tell you, I feel really lucky, and our time together really flew by. I think you're going to enjoy this podcast a lot.
Yeah, I got the pleasure of joining in on it, and we talked about this, Fritz. We could have sat there for 4 more hours and just kept talking with him. He was filled with so much insight and advice and just positivity. Like, I can't wait for everybody to hear this one.
Yeah, and some great stories.
Yes,
He dives into everything from his own growth journey at the theater. He started actually as a dishwasher in 1988 and talked about the many successful people he's had the pleasure of working with, including some incredible stories about people like Bill Murray and your hero, Kendall, Tina Fey.
Indeed.
To the power of comedy and coping with sadness, even. A few sad moments, a few tears, and in managing a workplace. We also get into the success of the Second City's B2B venture, Second City Works, which is focused on using improv to help those in business-centric roles with things like listening, public speaking, relationship building, interview skills. You really won't want to miss this. Stay tuned.
You're listening to the Grow Wire podcast, a place where you will learn the ins and outs of growing a business, running a business, or even taking your big idea, career, or personal development to the next level. It's all possible. Our host, Fritz Nelson, the editor-in-chief of GrowWire.com, will take you on an exploration of growth through candid conversations with some of the most brilliant minds in entrepreneurship, entertainment, business development, and more. Whatever your goal, we know you'll walk away with the right tools to help fuel your journey of growth.
Before we get into this episode with Kelly Leonard, it only makes sense for a note from our sponsors over at
The Second City.
That's right. If you want to challenge your company to innovate and elevate through laughter, Second City Works is the B2B side of this world-famous comedy mecca, The Second City. They've helped hundreds of Fortune 1000 companies inspire better performance using their award-winning improv and audience-driven techniques that are powered by humor. Interested in live events, hands-on workshops, campaign consultation, branded content, and a whole lot more? Yeah, they thought so. You can visit secondcityworks.com to learn more. And we got to actually see a little of this live on stage with one of our bosses, and it was pretty fun.
It was awesome. It was hilarious. It was great. And you can totally see how it works. Go check it out. secondcityworks.com.
We also want to make sure you head over to our website, growwire.com, for more stories just like Kelly's. In fact, you won't want to miss the Grow Wire Show episode with Kendall on The Second City. You can find that on our Grow Wire Show tab.
And please forgive me for my embarrassing attempt at improv, but it was caught on camera.
I'm sure it was great. And that reminds me, you also want to check out the latest episode of the Grow Wire Show featuring entrepreneur and author Samantha Edis.
Indeed. It's such a good, she really is a superstar. She's a superhero in my eyes. She actually was on this podcast episode before, so you may remember her, but she helps empower everyone, really, women, but everyone really, to find success, but also find balance in their lives, which I think is so important right now in a world where technology is at our fingertips. And sometimes we can just be so involved in work and not take a break to really just, do the things that make us happy, like work out or cook or be with our kids or our pets or whatever. Really, really great episode. Comes just in time for Mother's Day, which I thought was fitting. So go check it out on growwire.com.
Thank you, Kelly, for joining us here. We're at Sweet World 19, representing Grow Wire. And I want to start by diving into the history of Second City. Can you tell us how it started. Who, where, when. Those are the only W's I can think of right now.
Yeah. So Second City opened its doors. It was a snowy night in Chicago, December 16th, 1959. Started by three guys.
Was it a wet snow or a dry snow?
It would be a wet snow. I have no idea if that's true or not. I'm just going to go with it. Howard Alk, Bernie Solins, and Paul Sills. And the origin story, though, is kind of cool earlier. So really, the foundation of Second City is in these improv games, some of which you've seen played on shows like Whose Line Is It Anyway? But Second City uses those and used from the beginning in their training and sometimes in their shows. Those games were developed by a woman named Viola Spolin, who was a social worker at Jane Addams Hull House on the south side of Chicago in the 20s and 30s. And her job was to better assimilate immigrant children who were coming under her care. So catch this. She invents these games that bring kids together to better empathize, collaborate. A lot of the games are in gibberish because the kids don't always share language. Her son, Paul Sills, is studying at the University of Chicago. He loves these games. He loves playing them and watching them play. So he teaches them to his friends, Mike Nichols, Elaine May, among others. And they form the first improvisational theater in America called the Compass Players in 1955. That morphs into the Second City in 1959. So it's this really interesting development of a practice of a technique that was developed by these games that then became really funny when played. And then Second City, of course, takes these improvised moments and then refines them in rehearsal to become scripted moments, which is the classic Second City review. A lot of people know us more as an incubator for Saturday Night Live, and that's fair because what we do at Second City is 2 acts of scripted content, these little short scenes, and improvisation. So roots very early in America in the 20s and 30s. Whole thing started in 59, and we're almost 60 years old now.
When those kids were doing, I mean, was it funny?
Yeah, well, this is the interesting. So I'm married to a comedy professor. So you can imagine what my house is like, my poor kids. But the reason that comedy comes out of improv is improvisation is essentially exploring these moments that are, since they're unscripted, they're a lot of surprise. And a lot of what comedy is surprise. You thought something was going to go one way and it goes another way. Another thing that causes things to be funny is recognition. Oh, that's like my dad, he says that, or my wife does this. So that's another thing that arises when you improvise. And ultimately, the real thing that we're getting at in improvisation is you're going towards truth. And something that's true is often something that's funny or really sad, which can often also be really funny.
And then take it down the dark roads.
You know where I'm going with this.
Yes. So I'm going to challenge you to pick a handful of milestone moments over.
Sure.
We probably don't have the time to cover
my entire 30-year career.
Yeah.
Or Second City 60-year. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of seminal moments. Certainly in 59 to 61, this is where Second City was sort of cementing itself as an incredibly cool place to come and check out. In part because everyone kept leaving and becoming famous. So first Nichols and May, who weren't really officially Second City, but they were on Broadway. Everyone knew they came from that crowd. Then Alan Arkin and Barbara Harris have this success. And then a couple of years later, you have people like Robert Klein and Fred Willard and Joan Rivers, and then they go on and become successful. But really, the theater was still kind of like a theater that struggled to make its payroll every now and again until a show called Saturday Night Live came on, and essentially that almost entire cast was from Second City. And it's funny, I remember, I was lucky enough to work for all the founders, or at least know them all. And I don't think today, we may take for granted the kind of celebrity that back then no one would take for granted, because John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd were on Saturday Night Live, which was like the #1 late night show. They had the Blues Brothers, which was the #1 movie. They had a concert tour, which was the #1 tour. They had a Grammy Award for their album. I mean, they were, it was like crazy popular. And that's when Second City sort of exploded, was in the mid-'70s. And then we started our own show, SCTV, which also produced people like Martin Short and John Candy. And then later, I started working there in 1988. My first gig was as a dishwasher. It is not as glamorous as it sounds. The guy who got...
Wait. So your first job at the Second City was as a dishwasher.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
And the guy who got hired as a dishwasher with me first day was a guy we called Johnny Favs. You probably know him as Jon Favreau, the film director. we both had mullets. And there is photographic evidence.
Whoa. I want to see that.
Yes, it's in my wife's office at Second City. But yeah, that was my first gig, 88. Bonnie Hunt and Mike Myers were on the resident stage. Jane Lynch was in the ETC company. That's our other equity company. Chris Farley and Tim Meadows were in the touring company. Stephen Colbert was selling T-shirts.
So you talked earlier about Improv's role on Saturday Night Live, but a lot of these people obviously went on to do other things that are less improvisational, except for somebody like Colbert, who has to, I imagine, improvise constantly every night of the week.
I would suggest that everyone improvises, unless you were handed a script when you were waking up in the morning. And this is the key to why so many people, I mean, look, the track record is amazing, right? We've never stopped producing. I mean, look at today. So you mentioned Colbert, of course, but Jordan Peele, studied at Second City. A.D. Bryant, if you haven't seen Shrill, it's amazing. So we're continuing to produce this amazing group of talent. And the thing is that makes them so great is not just when they sort of improvise with each other for comedic effect, but the fact is improvisation makes you a better partner. It makes you a better collaborator. So when you're on...
How so?
Because, okay, I'll give you some examples. One thing you have to do when you improvise, you actually have to listen to the person across from you. You have to make your partner look good. You have to be extremely others-focused. Many people are not kind. I have another word for that, which I was going to use. And many people are belligerent, and many people are egotistical, and many people walk around thinking they're the greatest thing in the world. And an improviser takes for granted that they know nothing, so they're keying in on all the people around them. There's many other skills that we teach in terms of resilience, agility. One thing I always talk about with improvisation is it teaches you to sort of rapid prototype ideas. Because there are so many exercises which are really about, trying something a split second again. And that gives you this sort of like fearlessness and the ability to really, fall flat in your face and get right back up and get into it. And so what I know about most industries is that people who have great success are often failing a ton. And the thing is that what makes them so great is that they never stop trying.
Well, you mentioned something earlier that one of the keys to improv, or maybe one of the outcomes, is getting at the truth.
Yeah.
So even in a scripted scene, you still have to get at the truth, I imagine.
Yeah. Well, that's an acting thing, right? So you sort of certainly have the improvisational moment, and we refine that into these scripts, but still you have actors on stage and an audience there. And look, these guys are doing these shows, they're doing 300 times the same show. So you have to find some sort of emotional resonance. You have to find some level of connection time and time again. And this is what makes someone like, Colbert, I have a favorite scene at Second City that Stephen Colbert and Steve Carell developed. And I was there the night they improvised it, and they basically scripted it almost that night. And it's called Maya. And it was based on, Colbert was reading a lot of Maya Angelou work. The premise of the scene is that Colbert is going back to his hometown with his best friend, Steve Carell, and everyone keeps calling him Shirley when they approach him, and they're treating him differently. He's like, what's going on? And then Steve goes, I forgot to tell you, when I come home, I'm an old black woman. And the rest of the scene plays out, and it explores racism and explores privilege and all these interesting areas, and it's beautiful. And in part, one of the things that's so beautiful is that Carell is just watching this unfold, and his subtlety. I always call it like playing without the ball, right? Those great sort of athletes who are moving around and doing things when they don't even have the ball. That's what Carell does in that scene. And when we had our 50th anniversary almost 10 years ago, they came back and they did that. And they were rehearsing in my office because I had the script that I was able to pull it up. And I just never forget sitting there for a half hour, and they wouldn't leave until they got it right. And these guys are like at the top of their game, and it didn't matter their dedication to this work, and their wanting to not only connect with each other but connect with the audience was amazing. And anyone who was there that night, you can probably Google the scene called Maya at Second City. Will mention that this was one of the great scenes they'd ever seen live in front of them.
That's amazing. let's get back for a second. I just want to go back to your dishwashing days and what you.
Sure.
So how'd you get out of dishwashing and into?
Oh, I needed to get out. That is a terrible job.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, well, we do.
I have that job still, though.
You're still washing dishes?
Yeah.
Oh, dude.
At
So
home.
I convinced the general manager, Allison Riley, at the time, that I might be better hosting, which was when you seat the room. And so I did that for a while. And then I left. Bernie Solins, who was the founder of Second City, had sold Second City. He's the one who got me this job because he was starting a new theater called the Willow Street Carnival. It was written up in Time magazine. This is, like 1989. It was going to be the next Second City. It was a disaster. It was an utter failure. I left about a week before it folded, and I came back, and my friend Ann hired me into the box office. So then I worked in the box office in the early 90s, became box office manager, cut to 1992, and that's when I became producer of Second City.
So you just willed your way into this.
No, I lucked my way into this. So Joyce Sloan, who was the producer before me, had a series of health problems, like pretty significant health problems. And there was really no one in place to take that position. And at that point, I was the director of sales and the assistant to the executive producer, Andrew Alexander. And I showed up on time, and I was reasonably polite with everyone. So I got the gig. I was in no way qualified for this position. And here's the thing. I think one of the reasons I had success, in part, was in those early days, no one was really watching over my shoulder, and I was able to make a lot of mistakes and not get fired for them. You don't learn from your successes. And by the way, like no great story is like when everything goes right. The funniest stuff is your fiasco. That's what everyone wants to hear. And indeed, I think I don't learn stuff from my successes. I don't know about you. I learn stuff from my failures. And so I've had a lot of those, but enough that I learned from to then really, the mid 90s. I mean, this was sort of a magic time. So my first cast had Colbert and Carell and Amy Sedaris. I hired Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Horatio Sands. I developed shows with Seth Meyers. Jason Sudeikis, who's here at Sweet World, was in cast. The list is much longer than that, but I mean, it was kind of a golden era that you see playing out now on your television screens and on your movie screens.
But so once we get past the luck, then you did some things like hire those people. But what allowed you to do that?
I think a few things. Not getting in my own way, listening to people who are smarter than me. I benefited from an amazing sort of infrastructure that was just, everyone wanted to work at Second City. So those people all walked into the room and were brilliant in front of me and my colleagues. So I'd like to say I'm a brain scientist and I figured this all out, but if you look at the Second City before me, a lot of great people came out of it. And I have not been hiring for the last 4 years. A lot of great people are continuing to be hired. So I think that the sort of improv principles are so good, and they are so deeply rooted in the culture that it makes screwing up in a tragic way really hard when we pay attention to our stuff. And I'm not saying like that exists across. We're much more than just a theater now. We're an education company. We're a content company. We've got a B2B business. We do wellness work. And we're not perfect by any stretch. I often say we're like doctors who smoke. I wrote a book called Yes and my kids will gladly mention to you how much I say no. But at its core, these principles are so solid that when maybe the North Star does get lost, we have a place to refine it. And everyone knows that who works there.
What is your North Star? Not just at Second City, but you personally?
Yeah, so Second City, we recently did like some mission statement stuff, and we were talking about the idea around fearless comedy, which I like very much for what we do. I guess for me, it would be fearless humanity, approaching every day with a mindset that looks at all obstacles as gifts, that recognizes that you can find joy inside a struggle, and that just because stuff sucks doesn't mean you have to be sad or mad all the time. Because life ain't easy, man. I talk to people all the time, and I'm like, who has it easy? I know a lot of really wealthy, rich, powerful people, and they are no happier than anyone else. So yeah, I think fearless living.
Want to help save the planet? Here's an idea. Go nude. Unfortunately, not wearing clothes isn't realistic for most of us. But buying sustainable clothing is. Here's Gordon Seabury, CEO of Toad & Co.
Few know that garment production can generate tremendous pollution. So that's why we're hellbent on offering cleaner, sustainably made clothing that's stylish and long-lasting. But that's only half the battle at Toad & Co. When it comes to hitting our business goals, we've learned to focus on what we're good at and seek partners for other areas of expertise. So when it came to ensuring a consistent customer experience across all sales channels and knowing what was going on with all aspects of our business, we chose NetSuite by Oracle. They know business systems, we know eco-friendly clothes. A perfect match.
From accounting and finance to commerce and human resources, NetSuite is the #1 business system to help you simply manage your business. Right now, go to netsuite.com/toad to get your free guide, Crushing the 5 Barriers to Growth. That's netsuite.com/toad for your free guide and to hear Gordon bear all on Toad & Co.'s growth story.
And you mentioned that you learn more from your failures. What you said you talk about anything. So what failures?
A good failure?
Yes.
Oh, I got a bunch of them. Okay. So I had it in my mind that the classic hockey movie Slapshot with Paul Newman would make a killer stage production. So I sweet-talked the writer, Nancy Dowd, into the rights. I convinced Universal Pictures to let me do it for $1. And I got investors. And we decided, look, let's open this Slapshot live up in Toronto, our Toronto location. They love hockey in Toronto. And no one came. And I remember one of the investors who was a producer said, Kelly, you can't stop people from not coming to your show, which was great advice. And I look back and I'm like, oh, women buy theater tickets. What woman is going to want to see a hockey play? It wasn't even a musical. And I mean, it was just like wrong idea, wrong time, wrong place, wrong concept. And here's what I discovered. Often, because I've been at this for so long, people say, what tip would you give me? And I often say, be wary of your own success. Because when you have a lot of success, and I have as a producer, produced a lot of big shows, and people won't tell you no, and they won't tell you the truth. And they'll make assumptions like that you know everything, and you don't. So when you become very successful, that's the time where you really need to, my friend Kim Scott wrote the book Radical Candor. You need to encourage this idea of radical candor. You can say anything to me, poke holes in my idea. I'm strong enough to take it. And by the way, I'm probably missing more now than I did earlier, because earlier when I was hungry and less sort of rooted, I had more of an ability to see what was around me going on. And so I think that's a really important thing to know. I have more failures if you'd like to hear some.
Well, I'm also just wondering, I read a book by one of the Pixar co-founders, and they created a culture of
Ed Catmull's book.
Yeah. They created a culture of failure there.
Yep.
And like you talk about Slapshot, there's a play on Broadway right now going to rave reviews on Lehman Brothers.
Yeah.
Like, who would have thought that a play about the Lehman Brothers failure was going to be a monster hit,
Sure.
right? So
Yep.
unless you try.
Yeah. So, but you know what's interesting about that? Couple things. One is you want to be able to test out your bad ideas. So what you do is you do little staged readings and other things like that. What you don't do is invest like $250,000. And one of the things that often gets misunderstood about Pixar, especially when it comes to Steve Jobs, is because they had this amazing culture with the artists of giving them these notes. Do you know who wasn't involved in those meetings? Steve Jobs, explicitly, because he was not good at that part of the job.
Listening or the giving of notes?
Listening, being kind. You have to protect your artists. And that doesn't mean that they can't hear difficult notes, but they have to know the person delivering that to them really cares and loves them and is doing it for all sorts of supportive reasons. I don't think Steve Jobs, I know he wasn't known for his bedside manner. That doesn't mean there's not a place for him. Clearly, the guy was a genius. But in that room, he wasn't allowed.
Right. So through all these years of people coming through the doors of the Second City, you mentioned a couple of moments that stand out, but what are some other fun moments that you can tell us about?
I always like this story, and it was before my time, but I like to tell it because it makes me laugh. So apparently, Second City would do cast trades where the Toronto cast would come down to Chicago and the Chicago cast would go up to Toronto. So this is in the 70s. This is like 74. And so the Chicago cast was up in Toronto, and that cast included Bill Murray. And apparently there was a heckler, which seems weird in Canada. They're so polite, but there was a heckler. And Bill Murray from stage was like, dude, if you don't stop, I'm going to take you out and break your arm. And the guy didn't stop, so Bill Murray took him out in an alley and broke his arm. Now, the great part of that story is after the show ended, they went out drinking, and he got him to the hospital, reset the arm, then they kept drinking the rest of the night. So they were good. Another Murray story, just because I think they're the best, and I wasn't there, but I know this one is true. He was in the touring company, which is many of our people start by working in the touring company. And when you're touring at Second City, especially in those days, you're often in a van with your group, just driving around to like colleges and performing arts centers. So they were performing at St. Mary's next to Notre Dame, and they did the show, and there was a reception at the Chancellor's home. And so they went to the reception, and then everyone gets in the van, and this is winter, and they're driving back to Chicago. And the Joyce Sloan, who's the producer who told me the story, was driving the van, and everyone was sort of snickering, and then Bill had the window open. It's like, Bill, close the window. It's freezing in here. And he wouldn't do it. Like, what is going on? She pulled over the van. He'd stolen the Persian rug from the Chancellor's house and was holding it on top of the van. So she turned it around. They were right outside of Chicago. She turned it around, and he had to like ring the doorbell, and the Chancellor comes down in his bathrobe, and he's got the rug, and he's like, sir, I have to apologize. And returned the rug.
What did the Chancellor say?
Thank you for returning the rug.
Yeah. What else can you say?
Yes.
I want to talk about some of the programs that the Second City has that maybe people won't know so much about. We've kind of learned about the Second City Works, but why don't you talk about how that came to be and how it works?
So, as often happens at Second City, is our audience informs us what we're good at, and we're good at listening to them. That's an improv thing. So we've offered classes from the beginning, and in the beginning it was mostly professionals who wanted to do this work or other acting. And gradually we kept finding other people would come to these classes, and often it was business people. And what they were sort of saying to us was, look, I'm taking these skills back into the boardroom and having great success with them. So we ended up in, it was around the mid-'80s, starting a thing called the Second City Comedy Marketing Group that was then called Second City Communications, which is now called Second City Works, which is sort of the B2B arm of the Second City. So we work with all these Fortune 1000 companies. We're creating content for them. We are doing workshops in teamwork, creativity, innovation, agility. It's a lot of bespoke work because we have so many of these different kinds of exercises, and so many teams are sort of different. So we really get in there, figure out what's best for these clients, and then develop the programs. And this is everyone from Major League Baseball to Google, to the U.S. Army, to the Department of Education, to a bunch of more traditional companies that you would see hiring us. But it's a really diverse, interesting slate. I think we're even getting better at it because we're more and more tying ourselves to insights from the scientific community. And that's bringing a whole other sort of element to this work. So it's really fascinating. And I will tell you, because I've been around so long, that 10 years ago, while that was a nice, healthy part of our business, it wasn't anywhere near what it is today. I mean, I would have been laughed out of the halls of the University of Chicago had I gone up to them and said, hey, let's collaborate on a program together. And now that's what we're doing.
And you mentioned some of the metrics that these, the agility and so forth that these companies want to get out of it. But, what have you gone back to visit and watch the dynamics a year later?
Yeah, I mean that's we get hired back a lot, and so
Okay.
that's one of those signs. And increasingly we're figuring out ways to gather data. That's slow, that's new, it's hard because it's often not quantitative, it's qualitative. But we're doing some of that, and especially in the work that we do with academia.
And you mentioned science.
Yeah.
You're doing some work in that too, as
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, so a few summers ago, I found myself up at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. I thought I was going to sell them on a one-off class around negotiation and improv. And by the end of the session, we had much bigger ideas. And we announced a collaboration just a couple years ago called the Second Science Project. And this is with the Center for Decision Research at the Booth School of Business. And what we do in that project is we look at behavioral science through the lens of improvisation. So if you know anything about behavioral economics, for example, what that taught us is that the economy is not governed by the rational actions of people. People don't behave rationally when it comes to money. And this is now a well-grounded theory. And one of the things that they know is that our default setting is to do nothing or say no. And if you think about the core principle of improvisation, which is yes and, that is a nudge, so to speak, to get people out of their default behavior of doing nothing. So it ended up not being a huge leap, especially because the guy who wrote Nudge was the guy running the Center for Decision Research at the time, who's now a Nobel Prize winner, to look at this and go, oh, this is worthy of exploration. So for the last 2 years, we've been doing research. We've been developing executive education programs. We'll look at different, sometimes the scholars will come to us and say, we want to explore this phenomena. Sometimes we'll go and say, we want to explore that. Can I tell you about one thing that happened when we were in the lab? So one of the first exercises we taught them was this yes and exercise that we do. We pair up people. We tell them person A is going to pitch to person B that we're throwing a reunion in a year. Person A pitch, person B say no to everything. Go. Do that for about a minute. It's not fun, especially if the person getting said no to them. Then we have them switch places. Person B, you're going to pitch. The next person is going to say yes, but. And after that happens, we're like, some people are like, well, I felt better. We're like, yeah, but it's no with a bow tie. You still were getting to no, and you had to do all the work. Then we have them yes and every idea. And that's invariably louder and better and cooler. And that's usually where that lesson ends. When we did this for all the nerds, scientists at the University of Chicago, they are nerds. We are too.
Proudly.
Yes. They're like, well, that's great, but what happens when you have an irretractable problem? What happens when you can't yes and because you just don't agree with that idea? I'm like, I don't know. That does come up. What do we do? And so the scientists went and looked at the research they had. We went and sort of looked at the improv exercises and any other phenomenon. When we came together and started collaborating on this idea, we figured it out. And what we built a fourth pillar, and that pillar is called thank you because. And the idea is this. If I fundamentally disagree with your position, but I need to stay inside the conversation, the only way I do that is by offering first a thank you, which sets off the gratitude part of your brain. So you're not in fight or flight. I'm here, I'm saying thank you. The because is crucial. Then I'm describing not only what you just said to me, making sure I got it right, but finding some point of agreement. So the example I give with this is my daughter has a friend whose parents are anti-vaccine, which I don't agree with. But I want to stay in this relationship with them because I like them. My daughter's friends with this person. So I thank them for sharing their opinion, and I restated why they feel it. And my point of agreement was like, you want to help save your daughter, and you think she's in harm's way, and you distrust big pharma. Like, I'm good with that.
Yeah, I don't trust them
I don't
either.
trust them either. My concern is my daughter's sick, and she can't be around your daughter. And that allows them to also thank you for that and finding like, I get that. So we were able to really stay inside this conversation, and we're literally conducting this research right now. We're taking groups of 50, sometimes at the university, sometimes at Second City, sometimes offsite, running them, giving them a survey, running them through the exercise, surveying them afterwards. And it's been pretty powerful. The results that people feel like this is a technique for listening in a whole new way. And certainly, we all know the world we're living in right now. No one's listening to each other
Right.
at all. And they all think they're right. And there's a lot of blocking. And so, we're not saying you have to give up your agency or your passion or your ideas. But if you need to stay inside the conversation, you need to have some guardrails, and we think we have them.
And so what's the outcome of that? You stay inside the conversation. What does that mean in an organization?
You move forward. You don't stay stagnant, and you don't go backwards. And you find areas that you can move together with the other person. And I'm not saying this is like a cure-all. If you fundamentally don't believe something and someone else fundamentally, but those positions need to be fully understood and vetted first, so everyone's like, cool. And then when you have these points of agreement, at least you can maybe move on that.
Gotcha.
If you've ever met a famous athlete at a corporate event or gotten an official autograph, chances are Steiner Sports made it happen. Here's Brandon Steiner.
We believe that there's magic in the moments that sports creates. We get customers closer to the game and help companies use the power of sports to grow their business. We've been in business 30 years, and we've had multiple systems to keep track of all the athletes and all of our customers. Multiple systems means multiple headaches. So we made the move to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite lets us replace all of our finance, inventory, and CRM functions with one convenient system. Now all the departments can see the same data. And if I have a question about our business, I can get the answer quickly.
This month, NetSuite is offering a free 60-minute business review with an expert in your industry to identify opportunities to turbocharge your growth. To get your free review, go to netsuite.com/Steiner. That's netsuite.com/Steiner. netsuite.com/Steiner.
So maybe this would be a good time to just talk a little bit about how that yes and even thank you because works in improv.
Yeah. So in improv, which is essentially groups of people making something out of nothing, what we know is that the worst way to do that is by saying no. And you actually can't just stop at yes. The yes and is about affirming and contributing in order to explore and heighten. And this often gets misinterpreted. I have a friend near IL who says that if it can't be used for evil, it's not a superpower. So all the stuff I'm saying can be used for evil. Con men for years have been using it. But the yes and is about the front end of the creative process. We edit and say no a bunch, but we do that after we let the crazy idea exist for a while. And this is the mistake a lot of companies make and a lot of individuals make and a lot of people in relationships make, is they won't allow a space just to explore something that might sound a little bit crazy. Because often, if you open up by saying no to a person, you say no enough to a person, they ain't going to bring any more ideas. So this is a far more healthy way to empower the people you work with. It's a way to have kind of, unusual ideas stick around for a little bit. And by the way, when you yes and you've got these tons of ideas and everyone's been listened to and vetted, when you kill off the ideas that aren't any good, no one's going to care because they understand that they've been heard and they've been seen. And there's tons of behavioral science around this, that we long to be seen as who we actually are. And when we are, that's really, really satisfying. And improvisation is like a practice for that.
I think this is a good segue into, you also have a program with children.
Yeah.
Who would love more than even us as adults, I would imagine.
Well, they're better at it.
Need to just be who they are, right?
Yeah. So, I mentioned how the origins were in kids' games. We didn't do much with that until my wife and I, she still works at Second City too, we had our son, Nick, and he needed to do summer camp. And so we took him to the Looking Glass Theater to do summer camp. And we were leaving the final performance and we were saying, like, it'd be so great if Second City offered this because we wouldn't have to pay for it. And we're like, I go, Ann, you run the training center, I run the theater. I think we can just do this. So we started the summer camp program and then extended that to full year-round classes. And so just, thousands and thousands of kids now are sort of refining improv and sketch and stand-up. We also do that. But the improv program is the biggest. And it's wonderful because kids are inclined to play. And it's really good for teenagers. Like that adolescence experience. I tell this, I did a TEDx, my very first TEDx I did, I led with this story. And the story is this. I was in my office at Second City at the end of a Friday. It was the first summer camp that we did. And our son, Nick, at that time, he was 10 and he was chubby. And he had weird theater parents. So he was like this weird theater kid and he got bullied at school. But this week is amazing. He's having the best time. And I get in my car with him and we're leaving Second City. And he goes, Dad, you know what I love about improv class? I go, no, buddy. What do you love about improv class? And he goes, in improv, if you're nice and funny, you're popular. I mean, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the world I want to live in.
Sure.
And so this way that we can bring this to different communities, like kids or people with suffering from Parkinson's or people with dementia. These are all communities we're working with social anxiety, and seeing them be bolstered and emboldened, not cured, but given a sense of agency inside an affliction is amazing. We did an event. We have a guy on our staff, Jesse, who's got cerebral palsy, and he's very invested in broadening our ability to speak to different diverse kinds of audiences. And we did a show that was completely signed. And apparently the cast, unbeknownst to him, did some research and got some lessons so they could sign. They asked for an audience volunteer who was deaf, and they did the scene and sign with the audience member. And that audience member who left, like, it was amazing in terms of, like, I never had that experience in my life. How would I? Who does that? So those are the things that, like, you know, I've worked at Second City for so long, and the big bold names are totally cool, but that's not what gets me out, you know, up out of my bed in the morning and happy to go to work. It's that kind of stuff.
How do the kids approach improv differently than adults?
They're not so baked into their fear. They're more willing.
Even the teenagers?
Teenagers are a little baked in their fear, but they haven't been hardwired yet.
Okay.
It hasn't been schooled out of them. As I said earlier, this idea that you only learn from your failures is backed up by some science. And unfortunately, a lot of school is not about that. It's not about sort of celebrating, you know, you got it wrong. Now let's try to get it right. And so when the kids have the ability to sort of see that they maybe failed at something and they can get right back up and do it again, and they're, you know, and everyone's supportive around them, it's such an easy thing to take out of that sort of classroom experience and into your regular life. Because you know, this stuff is just about rooting out basic human behavior. You know, this is what goes on with human beings, and we're all sort of wired in a certain way. And if we want to be successful, a lot of times we have to unlearn the things that we've learned, and we have to get past our fear. We really need to get past our shame. That's the worst part. You know, fear is something I think most people can hopefully get by. Shame is the killer. If you're in shame, that is where the worst behavior comes from. So we really try to make sure no one is going to that place. And also, like, when everyone is sort of taught these rules of, like, yes, and even if you don't believe it, you say it enough, you start to believe it. And the whole environment changes too.
So do you know, I know you mentioned dementia and Parkinson's. Yeah. Are you also dealing then on the shame part with, you know, mental health?
Yeah. So the Improv for Anxiety program started pretty early. That was one of the first wellness programs that we had going. And what happened was a psychiatrist just took the classes, and then he started bringing the games back to his group sessions.
Oh, wow.
And then he decided he wasn't a good enough improv teacher, so he approached us. So we developed this program where group is an improv class, and everyone has their individual sessions with him offsite, and then they do a performance every year, which is hilarious because it's amazing. So that program has been a great success, and it's lovely. It's again, like I said, we're not like curing people, but we are giving people more practice in their ability to communicate, to try to look someone in the eye, to dial it down, that part of the brain. There's a neuroscientist, his name is Charles Lim, who I've become friends with, and he did research initially with jazz musicians and then with rap musicians, where he studied the human brain while it improvised. And basically what he discovered is that when you improvise, the fear part of your brain goes down. That's the major thing that happens.
Huh.
He just had Second City people last summer go out and improvise verbally under the MRI machine, the fMRI machine, and similar results. There's a paper forthcoming, but similar results were found.
Wow.
So this idea that literally your fear part goes down, and then what it frees up is the creative part of the brain, the one that will allow all different kinds of ideas in. So we were having lunch, and he's like, even if I stopped doing any more research. If we just looked at that alone, I think we could make amazing strides.
Wow. That's really powerful. I just want to end with a couple of questions about just comedy today. There's a lot of talk about pulling back. We've become obviously a society where we have to be careful of what we say in the wrong moments, the wrong things too soon. Are you seeing it change? Are people maybe more fearful, especially in an improv scenario where there's no net underneath?
Okay, I have opinions about this. For the people who say they don't want to tour the college campuses and that everyone's a snowflake and you can't do your cutting edge comedy, I will call bull on you and suggest that you simply are not creative enough to make the adjustment. Words change over time. My wife, the comedy professor, found this amazing study that showed that basically anytime a word for a mental disability got cemented, it became a insult. So retarded was a clinical term leading up till early 90s, mid 90s.
Sure.
We'd use it on stage. We'd never use it now,
right? Because
it's now a slur. Words change. And other stuff changes. The world changes and you can adapt. And there is so much incredible cutting edge comedy out there. Why would anyone say that there isn't? We've never had more. So this is a false idea that's out there. Now, the other thing that is true is that comedians only learn where the line is by crossing it. So what we have to figure out is in the sort of tech-enabled world that we live in, probably not a good idea to test the line out on Twitter in front of 1 million people who don't understand your context. That's what small live comedy clubs are for. That's what the classroom is for. The people who are trying to prevent that kind of testing in the classroom, I would suggest you're not doing it right. And as long, you got to have a safe environment and got to make sure it doesn't, cross boundaries. That has always been true. So I would suggest that the boundaries have changed, but the process hasn't. So we can live in a world where both things are true. We just tend to live in a world now because of our easy access to social media where nuance and context are not appreciated, and we just have to be more thoughtful.
You mentioned earlier, too, sadness and its role in comedy.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, comedy, one of the roots of comedy is pain. There's a great Joni Mitchell line, I forget what song it is, laughing and crying, it's the same release. It's very much about this great comedy is recognizing through laughter how terribly sad some stuff is. So, again, no one wants to hear your story where everything went right. That is not funny. I only want to hear your fiasco. That will have me rolling in the aisles.
Were there any people that you've come across that were especially good at that?
Oh, yeah, all the greats. And many of them have great sadness in their life. Tina Fey had some childhood trauma. So did Stephen Colbert. So did Chris Farley. So did John Belushi. Some of them made it through. Some didn't. And the ones who didn't, that's tragic and that's terrible. The ones who did found this was interesting. Mark Maron was doing a speaking date at Second City. And so he's never worked at Second City. He's a stand-up. We don't primarily do stand-up. But he riffed on this thing because I was talking to him before, and he's like, I'm looking at all the photos. And I'm like, yeah, died for his art. Brilliant. Died for his art. And then I get to the 90s. I'm like, oh, really well-adjusted human being who does great art. Oh, another really well-adjusted human being. And I'm like, and he basically dawned on him that he had built this myth that if you were going to be a great comedian, you had to be so screwed up or addicted. And that's just not true. Many of the people who are our greatest comic voices today are actually quite well-adjusted human beings.
Yeah. Well, like you said, if you are creative enough, you can overcome
work through it.
Yeah.
Work through the pain.
So I'm going to end with this. You talked about the things that get you out of bed nowadays, since you've been there for quite a while. The Second City started with improv really on the comedy front, but moved quickly into all these other areas.
Yeah.
As it turns out, it sounds like improv has more power in our everyday lives than maybe it ever did as
100%.
just a comedy vehicle.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. What we've recognized, especially with the work with the behavioral scientist community, is that human beings are tricky, and they don't make rational decisions for themselves often, whether it's voting or exercise or all. Like, we all pick the things that we don't do that we should do. And what we've recognized is these games and these exercises, many of them push you towards more pro-social behavior. They push you to be more kind, more thoughtful, and more wise. I don't know any human being who couldn't use that at home or at work. And if our work, if all it did was make people listen 2% better, I think we're changing the world.
Do you think you've done that?
I think we're working on it.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Kelly's right. Could you imagine if we all took some extra time to just listen, to say yes and or thank you because? It's some truly powerful stuff. I've even tried it out myself this week. I encourage all of you to look into how improv might benefit you or your organization. There's even a link in the bio to look into the Second City too. Thank you so much to Kelly Leonard from the Second City for joining us on this episode of the Grow Wire podcast. I also want to thank our editors over at Lampstand, our producer, Kendall Fisher. Thank you, Kendall.
Thank you.
And all of you, our listeners, for tuning in. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe.
Subscribe now. Bye-bye.
You just listened to the Grow Wire podcast with host Fritz Nelson. Make sure to keep tuning in for more episodes full of tips, tools, stories, and strategies to help take your personal and professional growth to the next level. Until next time.